Hello and welcome. Why has alternative energy never really resonated with Americans in a big way? Even as crude oil prices soar above $120 a barrel and there's growing pressure to reduce carbon emissions, the world's biggest oil consumer seems to be falling behind in finding sustainable energy sources. The United States burns around 20.5 million barrels of oil per day. That's more than the next 4 countries and the European Union combined. It's also among the world's top 2 energy producers, along with China, when one factors in nuclear power, coal, natural gas, and hydropower. But while China is now the global leader in alternative energy investment, the US has now slipped to 3rd among G20 nations in financing low-carbon technology. Observers say domestic politics is the reason why the US has struggled to keep up. Conservative American politicians argue that green energy is expensive and unsustainable and have called for more drilling for oil in the US. So today we ask, how critical is it for the United States to move to alternative energy? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we'll also welcome your phone calls onto the show. In just a few minutes, we'll be talking with author and journalist Robert Bryce, who has questioned the feasibility of green technology. But first, let's go to former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, who's relentlessly pushed for renewable energy during her 2 terms in office and now advises the U.S. nonprofit Pew Charitable Trust. The organization recently released a new report, Who's Winning the Clean Energy Race? Governor Granholm, good to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Riz. Glad to be on.
A pleasure, ma'am. Let me start by asking about this definition of clean energy. I think for a lot of Americans, it seems a little vague. They don't necessarily fully understand all the elements of it, and it may appear a bit ambiguous. And of course, I guess nuclear energy is thrown in there, which a lot of people are now a little wary of, considering what happened in Japan. In terms of definition, if you were asked what is your version of clean energy, what would it be?
Well, there's clean energy and there's renewable energy. Renewable falls within the umbrella of clean. For example, the President of the United States has called for an 80% reduction in our dependence on fossil fuels by relying on more clean energy, and he's including nuclear and natural gas, clean coal technologies in that. The Pew organization, the Pew Charitable Trust, has defined clean energy as really being renewable energy. So solar, wind, biofuels, biomass, those kinds of things. We're also very supportive of energy efficiency as well. And the report that you referenced, where the United States is falling behind, that really is in private sector investment in clean energy, renewable energy technologies, and that's what that refers to.
Why is it that the U.S. has fallen behind, as you've just described? I mean, considering it was leading at one point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was leading 3 years ago. So last year, China jumped ahead of the United States, and this year Germany jumped ahead of the United States. So for those who say that all of these investments are going to China because of low costs and low wages, it shows you, because Germany's in number 2 and Germany's wage structure is equivalent to that of the United States, that it's not just about wages. So what is it about? It's about policy. These countries, other countries, have determined that they are going to send a signal to those who invest that they're committed to a clean energy future, energy independence, and the jobs that go with it. The United States does not have national policy that sends that kind of signal to job providers and to the market. So that's what the Pew Charitable Trust is doing, is launching a national clean energy campaign. This is not, we're not talking, in light of the political environment which you referenced, we're not talking about a carbon tax, we're not talking about cap and trade, but there are specific policies that are doable in this political environment that we think we can get through Congress. For example, some kind of renewable energy standard where the U.S. makes a national commitment to getting a percentage of our energy from renewable sources.
Well, let me ask you, ma'am, how do you answer those who say that solar and wind energy, for example, are just, they cannot sufficiently meet the energy needs of the U.S. and essentially that those sources are unable to compete with conventional energy?
Well, I mean, today certainly they cannot provide energy as cheaply as oil. But clearly the investments that are happening, for example, in Germany, where renewable energy is taking up a larger and larger percentage of the overall energy footprint, that is an example of what we want to move toward. We want to have as many homegrown sources of clean energy as possible, including energy efficiency. So there's not just one solution, that there's a mix of solutions. But the bottom line is, for the reasons associated with jobs and our economy making us independent, that is why for the United States it's necessary to encourage the market to make those investments here.
Let me ask you to answer an email we had from a viewer in Cairo in Egypt, if you could please, ma'am. This came in from Omar Shaheen, who says, there's been talk of the oil lobby hindering efforts to go green in the past, especially during the Bush years. Is the Obama administration doing too little, too late?
Well, they're certainly pushing for it. Now, they're saddled, of course, with a Congress that has been reluctant. And I think that it's true that many of the oil companies have been very persuasive with members of Congress. But I do think that with the challenges that are occurring in the Middle East and in Japan, with energy sources being at risk, people begin now to see the importance, and especially now, of us generating our own sources of energy. And when you combine that with the fact that the unemployment rate is still high and the jobs that are likely to accrue that go with it, the opportunity is ripe. In this sector alone, since the year 2004, there has been a 630% growth in this clean energy economy in these investments in the G20 countries. And of course, when you have that level of investment, last year it was $243 billion being invested in this clean energy economy by the private sector. Well, when that happens, jobs go with it. So both for energy security as well as for jobs, we're at a moment where we're hopeful and we are convinced that we can persuade the U.S. politicians that it's time to act. And by the way, there's been national polls done by bipartisan pollsters that demonstrate that 84% of Americans want the United States to have a national policy that encourages renewable energy and energy efficiency, including 75% of Republicans, which many have attributed to be the resisting party.
Well, let me ask you to answer a call we've got on the line from Florida. Sean, thanks for being with us. What would you like to ask?
Hi. Actually, I don't have anything to ask at all because I already know the answer. This is just, the bottom line is that this is all bogus, all of it. Oil is not rare. It's everywhere. And it's only, the only place we're allowed to get it from is places where you can't go and check out what's going on, like either offshore, way out in the middle of the Gulf, or in tyrannical regimes like Saudi Arabia or in Libya. It's just like the drug cartel. Oil is not rare at all. It's everywhere, literally everywhere, and there's nothing more renewable than this supply of energy than oil. And it's the big oil who's behind all these fake green initiatives.
Okay, Sean, if I could ask you one thing, just, and I'll get the governor to respond in a second, but Sean, in terms of the environmental impact, do you have any concerns about oil, irrespective of how abundant it is? Do you have any concerns about the environmental impact?
Absolutely not. In fact, big oil is behind the oil spill in the Gulf. They did that on purpose to make it seem dirty and foul so that they could move us to nuclear energy, which is the dirtiest energy you could possibly imagine. Because it's complex. They want complex schemes. People are starting to find out that oil is not rare. It's literally everywhere.
Well, listen, what I'll do is, Shauna, let's get the governor to respond to that kind of sentiment. How do you react when you hear that kind of...
Well, I'm not even sure how to respond. I mean, obviously there is a limited supply of oil. We're not saying it's rare, but obviously fossil fuels have an end game at some point. But nobody's saying that you can immediately turn off the switch. But the notion that the oil companies have conspired in some way to push the green movement is very counterintuitive. That the oil companies are urging a move toward nuclear instead of oil, that's counterintuitive. So I'm not sure your caller has the facts straight.
Okay, cool. An email question for you, please, here, Governor, from South Africa, from Cape Town, where Cameron Peter wrote in saying, how market ready are alternative energy storage technologies? It's an interesting question.
It's a great question. In fact, I'm really pleased that you asked that because, of course, if we move to renewable, given that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, you have to store that energy at some point. And the way you store it is through the lithium-ion batteries. I can tell you, as the former governor of Michigan, the vehicle battery, which is going to be a lithium-ion battery for the electric vehicle, is the same kind of battery that you're going to use to store your renewable energy in. In the United States, prior to 2 years ago, we didn't manufacture the lithium-ion battery at all, and the technologies associated with it were for small electronic devices like your cell phone. Now it is being put into the vehicle, obviously a very large device, and you can store a lot more with it, and the technology is advancing extremely rapidly. It's sort of like Moore's law for the electric circuits, the electric circuit boards. You're seeing a diminution in the size of the battery, an increase in the length of a charge, and the lightening of it, meaning less weight. So the bottom line is the technology in the second and third generations of these batteries is advancing very quickly. It's going to be at par in terms of cost with the internal combustion engine very soon, and it's a great opportunity for the United States, I would say, to lead in manufacturing this technology as well.
Well, Governor, it's interesting you mentioned vehicles. Of course, your state, Michigan, lost a lot of jobs in the industrial sector and especially in the auto sector. And I know you've had some success with green jobs. You'd referred to that opportunity a little earlier. But let me ask you what experience you had specifically in Michigan in setting up the sort of green economy when it comes to jobs.
Well, we retooled our tax structure, and we pancaked state incentives on top of the federal incentives that were given through the Federal Recovery Act. So I'll give you one example. In the battery space, we didn't have any battery companies in Michigan that were manufacturing the battery for the electric vehicle, but we said, hey, we are the automotive capital. We better be the ones to build the next vehicle as well. So I went to our state legislature. I said, let's provide some incentives for battery companies to locate in Michigan. The Federal Department of Energy also wanted to provide incentives for battery companies. So in the end, between state and federal incentives and getting Michigan to have a renewable energy standard as well, we were able to convince 17 companies, battery companies and suppliers to those battery companies, to come to Michigan in just a year and a half. And those 17 companies are projected to create 63,000 jobs. Now, I say all of that to say that policy matters. For those who are listening, if you want to create jobs, you've got to send a signal to the market that you're committed to this technology. And certainly you have to be able to provide incentives for people to buy those cars until the technology is at cost, at par with the current technology, which is the internal combustion engine.
Governor, let me just ask you on the issue of nuclear power. Of course, there's a lot of confusion now post, the incident in Japan. A lot of people are very nervous and concerned. We've had people on this show saying actually there's a lot of misunderstanding about nuclear power, and it is actually a feasible way forward. How do you regard that prospect?
Well, I think nuclear power is clean power. Obviously, there are a lot of concerns about the waste and where these plants are located, and whether obviously a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami would cause some sort of leak. That's obviously what we're seeing in Japan. But, and I would say in the United States, those concerns are probably going to slow the effort to permit new nuclear power plants. I worry about that, but I do think that that's the case. But it just stokes the need to provide other kinds of energy as well. You can't slow down on any of these. Let's put the pedal to the metal on all of these technologies for the United States anyway, so that we can get the benefit of energy independence, clean energy, and the jobs that go with it.
Seeing just a quick final thought, perhaps, Governor, seeing what's happened in the past 3 years and where the U.S. has sort of slipped back, how do you remain optimistic that that ground could be recovered, that perhaps there could be a wider application?
It's a really good question, but the reason why I'm optimistic is because we have done some very deep research on what is acceptable to citizens, even in the most resistant districts. And Americans really do want to see us as a nation have the jobs and the energy security that go with it. The polling numbers are very clear. We just got to convince the members of Congress that their citizens want to see this happen as well. And you look at states like Michigan, where we're projected to get about 150,000 jobs over the next decade just in the installations that we've had. I mean, you can't argue with success, and so we want to make sure that we amplify those best practices across the country to help persuade citizens so that they can persuade their elected representatives that now is the time to act.
Ma'am, thank you very much for your time.
You bet. Thanks, Riz.
And that was former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm talking to us from her home state. Now, joining us from Austin, Texas, is Robert Bryce with the conservative U.S. think tank, the Manhattan Institute. He's also author of the book Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. Robert Bryce, good to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Riz.
So I've got to start by asking why you consider that term clean energy very vague. What is it that really bothers you about it?
Well, what does it mean? You asked Governor Granholm for her definition. She said it was non-hydro renewables, which solar, wind, biomass, geothermal. President Obama, in his recent statements in the State of the Union, and then again in his address at Georgetown University about 10 days ago, included natural gas and coal. And in fact, his list, if you look at it, includes under the definition of clean energy, everything but oil. If you look at the IEA's recent analysis on clean energy, they excluded oil and excluded natural gas and included coal. So this is just another, in my view, another marketing slogan, another I think, a cheap slogan that demeans our political discussions, both here in the United States and around the world. For examples of that, just look at what Governor Granholm just said: energy independence, clean energy. Well, what is energy independence? It is another slogan we've heard now for more than 4 decades, at a time when the U.S. is the world's single biggest energy producer, single biggest energy consumer. Why would we ever want to be independent of the world's single biggest market? It makes no sense.
Let me ask you what your alternative is then. What is the option?
Sure. Well, to use one of the numbers that the governor, former governor, threw out, she said we're now spending globally $243 billion on clean energy technology. Okay, well, that sounds like a lot, but consider this. The U.S. alone in the upstream oil and gas sector is spending $250 billion a year just drilling new oil and gas wells. What we're seeing now is this continuing discussion about, oh, well, we have to use solar, wind, et cetera. The reality is right now in the U.S., we're on the verge of, we've really begun what's called the shale gas revolution. Natural gas production in the United States is now at record levels, surpassing even the records in the early 1970s. And that technology is now going global. ONGC, the big Indian company, recently announced the first shale gas production in West Bengal. We're going to see this new technology, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, now going global, and it will bring huge quantities of new natural gas into the market. That is really good news for everyone.
But there is still the issue of CO2 emissions with natural gas. That's something to consider when it comes to the environment.
Absolutely. And I understand the arguments on global warming. I've read both sides. To me, I just believe that what we're hearing in terms of goals, particularly for CO2 reductions from such as President Obama, an 80% reduction by 2050, is completely unrealistic. But if I can just add just a quick analysis, Riz, to this discussion about scale. The governor said, well, she favors the non-hydro renewables, solar, wind, biomass, geothermal. That's fine. In the United States right now, we are getting 140 times as much primary energy from coal, oil, and natural gas as we're getting from all of the non-hydro renewables combined. So we can double them, triple them, quadruple them. It will be effectively have no effect on the overall economy of the United States because they're such essentially negligible sources in the overall scheme of things.
It does sound, though, the way you're saying it, Mr. Bryce, that there shouldn't even be any effort in trying to move into an alternative direction. Is that the case?
No, I didn't say that. I'm all for, if private entrepreneurs want to pursue these technologies, I'm all for it. What the governor is talking about in many cases these are jobs or opportunities that are created only because of subsidies and mandates. Let me give you some numbers on the job side. She said, oh, well, what was it? Energy independence, clean energy, jobs that go with it. Corn ethanol, one of the longest running scams in American history, one of the longest running robberies of American taxpayers, has been justified continually as, oh, well, this is biofuels, we're displacing oil. If you take the numbers that the corn ethanol lobby has recently put forward, saying they support 70,000 jobs, and use the overall numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, each of those jobs cost $230,000. What about wind? I live in Texas. The state comptroller here in the state recently did an analysis and it figured that every wind energy related job in the Lone Star State cost taxpayers $1.6 million. Sure, we can create jobs with these technologies, but at huge cost to the taxpayer.
Let me get an email question to you, sir. This came in from a viewer by the name of Akuzike Tawe, who wrote in saying, if U.S. corporations were to utilize more renewable resources such as solar energy, would they be more profitable or would it set back business growth? What do you think?
Well, if you look at the latest numbers, again, I really try to pull the numbers out of from various sources. The Energy Information Administration recently did an analysis. They figure that natural gas-fired electricity will be the cheapest form of electricity for at least the next 5 years at roughly $63 per megawatt hour. Onshore wind costs about 50% more. offshore wind will cost 4 times as more, and solar thermal and or PV will cost something on the order of 5 times more. So if you're going to have U.S. corporations using more solar, they're going to be paying more for their electricity, and therefore I think that is overall a drain on the economy, not an addition.
How do you regard the way the drilling seems to have become such a politicized issue? It almost seems to be a party line one way or the other.
Well, it is interesting that Governor Granholm, she's from the Democratic Party, but what have we heard out of the Democrats? Oh, well, we need to, and particularly President Obama. What did he say in January in the State of the Union? Oil is yesterday's energy. 10 days ago, he said we need to expedite drilling here in the United States. Look, we have to drill here in the United States. This is not only good for America's energy security, it's good for American jobs. And I'm definitely pro drilling here. I want to see the price of oil brought down. I'm for cheap, abundant, reliable energy across the board.
Now, looking at the situation, of course, a lot of people are wary of drilling, considering what happened with BP and the spill. And that has sort of set back certainly public attitude towards drilling, hasn't it?
Well, I don't know that that's the case. I don't have poll data at hand, but if you look at what has happened in the Gulf, last summer we were hearing, oh, this is a tremendous catastrophe. This is, as one activist put it, America's Chernobyl. Well, what happened? The spill dissipated very quickly, and the long-term results, I think, are going to be negligible. I think we should be expediting offshore drilling in the Gulf, and because there's huge resource available there, and I'm for opening the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's an area that has been off limits for decades, and we know there are tremendous oil and gas assets there that are being kept offline for no, in my view, no good reason.
Let me ask you a little bit about the views on carbon dioxide capture and storage, CCS, because of course one of the concerns is with fossil fuels, the CO2 emissions and the climate impact on them. Now, one of the ideas is to be able to take that, compress it, and effectively inject it into sort of geopolitical, into geological formations.
Geological formations, sure.
Yeah. So in terms of trying to deal with the CO2 emissions, if hydrocarbon fuels are still to be used, how do you regard the idea of trying to at least lessen the impact of the CO2 emission?
Well, let me just take the last point there first, and that is, let's be clear, Riz, hydrocarbons are here to stay. Love them, hate them, or indifferent, it doesn't matter. On a global basis, 9 out of 10 units of energy, 9 out of 10 units of power that we use come from coal, oil, and natural gas. And energy transitions happen over decades or centuries, not over years. But to your direct question about carbon capture and sequestration, I don't think it's viable on anything close to a large scale. Let me just give you the numbers real quick. Even just to, one of the main problems is what's called parasitic load. To capture the CO2 from the flue of a natural gas or coal-fired power plant requires you to use about 25% of the power produced by that given plant. But injecting that CO2 underground on any kind of scale is not really viable, because 10% of CO2 globally, if you liquefy it to supercritical, you would have to fill the equivalent of about 41 super tankers per day. It's a vast amount of CO2, so any kind of large-scale CCS is just simply not viable.
One thing that a lot of people feel is denting the US's image is the fact that it's being expected to lead, at least in the race for renewable energy and renewable energy sources. How much is the sort of political capital of the US on the global stage being lost by this debate?
Well, I don't know, Riz. I can't really answer that. I think that it's interesting if you think about that, and then you look at some of the statements from people such as Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPCC. He's from India. Prior to the big meeting in Copenhagen, you may recall that he said, look, we have 400 million people in India that don't have electricity. We're going to burn coal in India, is effectively what he said. So does the U.S. need to exert leadership? Yes, and I think they are. We have a vibrant venture capital community here in the United States. We have a vibrant opportunities for all kinds of investment, and we're leading the world in improvements in energy efficiency. So I think the U.S., make no mistake, is a leader in the world economy, and will continue to be, not only in energy but in all kinds of areas. But particularly when you look at the shale gas revolution and the shale oil revolution, that is coming out of the United States, and I think that's incredibly good news.
Well, I want to thank you, Robert Bryce, for joining us and giving us your views there. Thanks a lot.
Sure, thanks, Riz.
And of course, before that, we had the former governor of Michigan, Jennifer Granholm, giving her views on that too. Now, remember, thank you for joining us with your questions too. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, Libya standoff. A ceasefire is rejected by opposition forces, but accepted by Muammar Gaddafi. How far are the two sides from reaching some common ground? Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.